Hi, I'm Ryan Bebej. I'm a member here at Fairway Reformed Church and also a professor of biology at Calvin College. And this is a reprise of session 1 of my adult education series called Perspectives of a Reformed Paleontologist. We did not actually record this the first week, so this is a re-recording so that those of you who missed it are able to sort of catch up on what we talked about. Here's an overview of the series. In this session, I'll be talking a lot about my journey, my own personal history, as I wrestled with these questions of science and faith. Session 2 is where the real meat of the series is, where we talk about the different models for how science and faith can interact with and inform one another. And then finally, in session 3, we'll talk about just some final thoughts, kind of wrapping everything up, and give some time for questions that anyone has as well. But before we start everything off here, I just wanted to share some initial thoughts before we delve into these topics. The first one is that I might be presenting some things here that might ruffle some feathers a little bit, might shake some of your foundations maybe a little bit, some things you haven't ever thought about before. And I'm certain that there are going to be some things that I'll talk about that you might disagree with me on. And I think that that's okay, and I think one of the things that I want to emphasize so much is that, especially as Christians, there's so much more central to our faith that we agree upon relative to what we disagree about. So I just always want to keep that in mind. Second, I know that dealing with these topics can be really challenging, can really push us in a lot of ways. It might be uncomfortable at times, thinking about things in new ways. But one of the things that I always want to emphasize to people as we deal with difficult questions like this is that we really don't have anything to fear in our search for truth, especially if we believe that God is the source of all truth. Then asking hard questions is okay. And as long as we keep searching, we'll be searching out what God has to tell us. So there's nothing to be afraid of here. Lastly, I think it's important as we deal with things, especially where things can be a little bit contentious, that we always model Christ and how we interact with one another in both our actions and our attitudes. And I think here about modeling the fruit of the Spirit, like love, peace, patience, gentleness, and just being as humble and gentle as we can be as we discuss all of these different issues. So that's always something that I think is important to keep at the back of our mind as we work through these things. So here's an overview of what I'll be talking about in this session. I'll spend some time just talking about my upbringing, where I came from, and how that helped to shape some of my initial ways of thinking about science and faith. Then I'll spend some time talking about my experiences in college and graduate school and how I sort of ended up on the path that I'm currently on today. I'll spend a good deal of time talking about my particular area of research, looking at walking whales, which might be something that's new to a lot of you. And finally, I'll give a very brief overview of the next session as well. So starting at the beginning, where it all began. I was born and raised in a small town called Princeton, Illinois. You can see it with the red pin on that map there. It's about an hour east of the Quad Cities, east of Iowa. If you drive on Interstate 80 through Illinois towards Iowa, you drive right through it. If you blink, you might miss it. So it's about 7,500 people. And I was raised here as the fourth of 5 children in my family, 3 girls and 2 boys. And it was a really great place to grow up. Had a lot of family around and had a really good church community and a good school system there as well. And I really think that it's my church and my high school that probably helped to shape a lot of the views I had about science and faith as I was growing up. We went to an evangelical covenant church in my hometown. And in our church, questions of science weren't really discussed all that much. It didn't seem to be a topic that people got really fired up about. But I certainly sort of came away from there with a sense that science, as we know it, modern science, and faith were a bit at odds, and that they had some different things to say, and sort of the default position was to believe what the Bible said and sort of not worry about what the scientific things said, and that was about it. I even saw this reinforced in my high school as well, a public high school, where as a freshman there I took a biology class, and we got to the topic of evolution, and what I remember from that particular unit was, okay, here's this topic, evolution, we've got to talk about it because it's sort of part of the state standards. So know this stuff for the test. You don't have to agree with it. You can kind of forget about it when we're done with the unit. And that's about all I remember. I don't really remember any other details from that topic at that particular point in time. So certainly as I was sort of going through my high school years and getting ready to prepare for college, I certainly was skeptical of science. And certainly thought that a lot of the things that maybe scientists might say that seemed contrary to my faith simply were that. They were contrary to my faith, and I was going to stand strong in my faith and kind of ignore all of that scientific stuff. I got to the point graduating from high school where I needed to make a decision about where to go to college. And for years I had planned on going to Bradley University, a small private college in Peoria, Illinois, about an hour south of where I grew up. This is where I had spent a lot of time as a kid going to basketball games with my grandfather. My brother graduated from there. My best friend, who was a year ahead of me, was a freshman there when I was a senior in high school. And we were planning to be roommates together, and it was kind of an easy decision. But during my senior year, right at the beginning of my senior year of high school, I started to just feel this tugging on my heart that I should look somewhere else. And I remembered this place called Calvin College. Again, growing up in a community that didn't have a single Reformed church in town, didn't have a very large Dutch contingent. This wasn't a place that a lot of people in my high school ever talked about. One person I had known who had been a year older than my brother had gone there as a student and loved it. My best friend had visited there and liked it, but opted to stay closer to home. And I thought, well, what could it hurt? I'll go up and I'll take a visit to Calvin and see what it's like. My dad and I came up on a Thursday night. We stayed in a hotel and went to the Fridays at Calvin session the next morning. So I didn't even kind of get the whole staying in the dorm experience. But I was there for about an hour and a half that day, and I knew that that's where God was calling me, that He wanted me to attend Calvin College. And so that day, decided that that's where I was going to hopefully go, and through some prayers and some financial aid and everything, we were able to actually make that happen. And that was the start of some really formative years of my life. While I was a student at Calvin, I certainly had sort of that collection of great college experiences with friends. Of course, being really ridiculous and having fun with my friends here, as you can see in the upper left-hand part of the picture. I was in a band with those guys for 3 years, where we played a bunch of performances around Grand Rapids and throughout the Midwest. It's also where I met my lovely wife, Melissa, as well. She was the teaching assistant in my comparative anatomy lab, and nothing nefarious happened at the time, I promise. And in fact, she didn't really like me much at the time, so I'll let her tell that story. She's fond of doing so. But I had a great experience there, but what I want to focus on is sort of my vocationally, where my interest in biology came from. Coming in as a freshman, I was completely undecided. I wasn't sure if I wanted to major in science and psychology and religion or German. And I heard a seminar during my first year about vocation and sort of looking for that place in the world where you have a passion and the world really has a deep need. And as I started sort of thinking about that and thinking about the gifts God had given me, the things I really enjoyed to do, where I felt like there was truly a need, I thought, well, maybe I'll become a high school teacher and I'll teach science. I'll teach biology and chemistry and things like that. That first year I took a biology class in cell biology and genetics, and what I remember from that class is that it really helped solidify for me what I had thought about things like evolution, where I was highly skeptical of it and thought that scientists were overstepping their bounds in terms of what they were proclaiming based on the evidence that was available. And then it was the spring of my freshman year where I took a class called Animal Biology, Biology 242, and it was here where we actually started to study evolution in depth. And I realized in hindsight that I had never really learned how evolution worked. I'd never really wrestled with what evidence there seemed to be for it. And here was a class where we spent probably about a third of the class talking about and learning about evolution. And this was the first time I started to feel sort of the foundations of what I thought of all these things kind of tremble a little bit, because I started to see just how strong the evidence was and the volume of evidence, just how much of it there was. But at this point, I really hadn't sort of changed my mind, but the wheels were definitely turning, and I was thinking about these things in a new way. As a sophomore, I took 2 geology courses with Ralph Sturley, who ended up becoming a mentor of mine and a good friend. And this is where I became just thoroughly convinced that the rock record appeared to show an Earth with a very, very long history. And this was an area that I had never studied before. I'd never learned about rocks and how to look at stratigraphic columns and things like that. And here I saw in detail the evidence for a very complex and long history of life on Earth. And this was, something that hit me really hard and didn't take very long to convince me of its veracity. I took a plant biology class that year and also a comparative anatomy class. This was actually the class where I met my wife Melissa. And these two classes together really affirmed my calling to become a biologist because I really loved them both. During interim that year, though, was when I took a class that completely changed my life. The title of the class is This Changing Earth, Biological Evolution, Creation, and Human Responsibility. So at this point, I was totally primed for delving into really difficult questions, trying to understand how these processes worked, and seeing, okay, is the evidence for these types of ideas strong or not? And this was wonderful because this class was co-taught by Ralph Sterling, who was a geologist and paleontologist, and Dave Warner's a plant biologist. And they taught it in such a way that they were able to present challenging ideas in ways that were absolutely not threatening at all, where sort of the context of everything was thinking about how our faith could potentially deal with scenarios like we were talking about here. And it was this class where I really veered off onto a particular trajectory, and it was at this point that I realized that I really wanted to study evolutionary biology and understand how this thing worked. During this class, we read this article by Kate Wong from a 2002 issue of Scientific American. It's called The Mammals That Conquered the Seas. And this is where I read a story about, primarily about a researcher named Philip Gingrich, a paleontologist at the University of Michigan, and how over the course of 20, 25 years, he and many of his students had begun to uncover the really interesting and strange evolutionary history of cetaceans, the group that includes modern whales, dolphins, and porpoises. But these things didn't look like the cetaceans I was familiar with because they had 4 limbs, they had arms and legs, and they appeared to be able to walk around on land. So we're talking here about what I colloquially call walking whales, and I had never heard about such a thing before. As a part of our interim class, we actually took a field trip to the Museum of Paleontology at the University of Michigan. And these photos are actually photos I took on that trip when I was there. And we're actually able to see some of these fossils. You can see a fossil called Dorodon hanging from the ceiling here. It's about an 18-foot long whale that has very tiny but fully formed limbs associated with it, hind limbs associated with it. We even got to see the hind limb of another more ancient whale, one that's called Pakicetus, and you can see that it has an extremely well-developed hind limb with a femur and a kneecap and a tibia and a fibula and ankle bones and toes. And you can tell based on its anatomy that it was using its feet as paddles for swimming in the water. And this was just astounding to me to see these types of fossils and realize, okay, these are not just pictures in a magazine article, these are real things that I can look at and hold in my hands. And we've got to sort of think about, well, what do these mean? In terms of the history of cetaceans and for evolutionary processes. And so I, again, just was so fired up about this topic and wanted to learn more. Ralph Sterling recommended this book to me by Carl Zimmer, who's a really excellent science writer who has written for National Geographic and New York Times and other places. And it's a book called At the Water's Edge, Fish with Fingers, Whales with Legs, and How Life Came Ashore but Then Went Back Out to Sea. And this was a book that I read immediately, my spring semester of my sophomore year. And, I really at this point started to see the strength for the evidence of evolution. And that got me excited about studying it. But at the same time, I was even more motivated, I think, to study evolution because I wanted to understand how it could possibly fit with my faith. So after my sophomore year, I went back home to Princeton. I spent 40 hours a week working in a warehouse, driving power equipment, lifting heavy things, and was delivering pizzas at night, about 3 nights a week. And every spare moment I got, I was being the ultimate nerd. I was reading books on science and faith, and these are the 6 books that I actually read that summer. I read a book called Christianity and the Age of the Earth by Davis Young that deals with the geological evidence for why the Earth appears to be as old as it is. His book, The Biblical Flood, which is an excellent book using the flood as a case study for how the church has responded to extra biblical evidence in the past. And then several other books by other authors that have different ways of integrating their faith with the scientific evidence that we see. And so it was clear to me when I was spending all my free time as a college student during the summer reading books like this, that this was my calling. This was the area that God wanted me to work in. And so I decided at this point to shift from being a high school teacher to going to graduate school for a doctorate, where I could study evolutionary theory in great detail. And at this point, in changing this trajectory, I realized, okay, as preparation for graduate school for my future career, I just want to get as much experience doing science as I possibly could. The following year, I was able to go on an interim trip to Hawaii, a really wonderful place to go when you're living in Michigan in January, to spend 24 days in the Hawaiian Islands. You can see me in the picture in the lower left there with a stick trying to pull lava out and seeing it crystallize into volcanic glass almost instantly before your eyes. See me in a tree fern forest as well. Just a wonderful experience to get out in the field, to study tropical ecology and island biogeography, understand more about how volcanoes work, and how to read rock records as well. Just a really amazing experience. The following summer, after my junior year, I spent time doing research with Dave Warners, where I studied plant ecology with another student, another great field experience, trying to understand why plants grew, where they grew. And then my senior year at Calvin, I took on an independent research project with Ralph Sturley studying the Ada Bible Church Macedon. Ada Bible Church, of course, in Ada, Michigan, back in the late 90s when they were breaking ground for either a new expansion or a driveway, I can't remember which, uncovered parts of a Macedon skeleton. And they called Ralph Sturley at Calvin, who was a paleontologist, who led a dig that summer to excavate parts of that Macedon. And I spent time looking mostly at the vertebral column of the Macedon because it appeared to have some sort of pathology or deformation, and trying to understand what that looked like. And this work involved some trips to the University of Michigan to see some comparative specimens of mastodons that they had there. It allowed me to present at my first scientific meeting as well. Again, just a really, really good experience, and one that got me really excited about studying anatomy and evolution and fossil animals. During the course of my senior year at Calvin, I applied to a number of graduate programs, and ultimately I was accepted and opted to go to the University of Michigan. There I was in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and I had the opportunity to work at the Museum of Paleontology, which you can see here, a place that many people, especially those that grew up in southeastern Michigan, have visited ever since their childhood with grade school field trips and things like that. And the person I was lined up to work with there was Philip Gingrich, the person whose work on fossil whales I had read about as a sophomore at Calvin, and whose work had got me excited about the field and got me interested in studying evolution and paleontology. So it was just a real wonderful experience to be able to go and learn from him and to learn from all of his experiences and ways of thinking about evolution and about cetaceans and things like that. And this is where I kind of want to veer off now and tell you a little bit more about that work. You know, whales are extremely interesting animals, but you might wonder, why whales? What's so interesting about whales, and what do they tell us about the history of life on Earth and of evolutionary theory? Well, you know, when people think of whales, they probably think of all kinds of different things, but one of the things that I think is most important to think of when we think of whales is the fact that they're mammals. They're mammals like you and me, like your dogs and your cats at home. How do we know that? Well, they do the things that mammals do. We breathe air, right? With lungs. That's how we extract the oxygen and get that into our body to be able to fuel our tissues and our metabolic needs. Whales, like all mammals, feed their young with milk from mammary glands. They have placentas and live births. They have hair, at least in some form. They have very large brains. But for me as a paleontologist, for someone who works with skeletal material so often, there are dozens of skeletal features that show us that whales are mammals and not reptiles or anything else like that. So we know that whales are mammals, but what makes them so interesting as mammals is that they're secondarily aquatic. What do I mean by that? Well, most mammals are terrestrial, meaning they live on land. Got some of my favorite mammals up here, things like the red panda and the wolverine, my dog over there on the right. Most mammals live on land, and it's clear from the fossil record that mammals arose on land as well. And we see the mammals that live on land, and they're adapted for different lifestyles. And we know, if we think a little bit about that, that there are actually mammals that are adapted for life in water as well. These are mammals that we call secondarily aquatic. Okay, this includes things like otters and pinnipeds, which include seals and sea lions and walruses. Also what we call sirenians, including the dugong and the manatee as well. And these are all animals that spend a lot of time in the water, and they have adaptations that help them to be successful in the water. But probably no mammals are as well adapted for water as cetaceans are. Okay, so Cetacea is an order derived from the Latin word cetus for whale, and this includes all whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Okay, large-toothed whales, dolphins, and porpoises are what we call odontocetes, which means toothed whales, odonto meaning teeth, cete meaning whale. And then we have the large mysticetes, or baleen whales. Misty refers to mustache, which is referencing the baleen that these animals have in their mouth, the hair-like structures that they use to filter their food items out of the water. And when we look at any of these different cetaceans that are living their entire lives in the water, we can see all kinds of external features that help them to be successful with that lifestyle. They've got an extremely short, stiff neck that helps to sort of link their head in with the rest of their body to allow them to move through the water in a very efficient way. They've got their front limbs are shaped into paddles, which they can use for steering. They actually don't have hind limbs anymore. They've completely lost external hind limbs to decrease the drag they experience during swimming. They've got a specialized horizontally flattened tail fluke at the end of their body, which they oscillate up and down to propel themselves through the water. So you can see just all of these external features that allow these animals to move very efficiently and effectively through the water. And this doesn't even get at all the physiological and internal anatomy adaptations that we see that help them to be successful for life in the water as well. Now, if we're looking at whales as being aquatic mammals, and we have this idea of evolutionary theory and common descent sort of at the base of all of these things as well, then anytime we have a mammal that is aquatic, this necessitates an evolution from terrestrial ancestry. And we know that the demands for living on land and in water are really different from one another. So that animals that are well adapted for life on land are generally poorly adapted for life in the water and vice versa. So anytime things are evolving from land to sea, that requires a very, very drastic change in adaptive zone and all kinds of anatomical and physiological changes that must take place in order for this type of thing to happen. And for decades, looking at the history of whales and what people thought about whales and where they came from, even the best scientists really didn't have any really solid evidence to illustrate how this actually occurred with whales. Okay? These transitional fossils, the ones that are indicated by the red arrows there between those two adaptive zones, were almost completely unknown. But this has been until relatively recently. Because over the past 30 years or so, the fossil record of the earliest whales has completely just exploded. We now have over 50 known species of early cetaceans that we call archaeocetes, archaeo meaning ancient, cete meaning whale, so the ancient whales that bridge the gap between whales that appear to have been fully aquatic and the terrestrial four-legged ancestors of all of these whales as well. And so here we see several different examples of some of the fossils that are known. Pakicetus and Ambulocetus at the top on the right are animals that were clearly adapted for being able to move on land fairly effectively, but we know from other lines of evidence that they were spending quite a bit of time in the water as well. We have unusual specialized whales like Remingtonocetus, which was one that was the subject of my PhD research. And we have some which are extremely well known based on their skeletons, such as Myocetus, which is again another semi-aquatic whale with fully formed hind limbs, but was clearly spending a lot of time in the water. And Dorodon, which you've seen already, which had to have been a fully aquatic whale, given that its hind limbs are reduced so much that there was no way it could have supported itself on land. The oldest of all of these fossils, everything except for Dorodon up here, are actually known exclusively from India and Pakistan. And Dorodon is one of several species that we know from the desert in Egypt. And so you might wonder, well, why in the world are we seeing these things kind of in the mountains of Pakistan and in the desert in Egypt, especially if these animals were aquatic? Well, if we use plate tectonics and other geological reconstructions and take ourselves back to the Eocene epoch about 50 million years ago, this is what it looked like. You can see some familiar continents here. You can see where North and South America are. You can see Africa and Eurasia. But you notice that Africa hasn't really bumped into Eurasia yet. There's still a waterway there. India, in fact, is still sort of a subcontinent that's not attached to the Eurasian continent proper yet either. And there's a seaway that connects what is the modern-day Indian Ocean to the modern-day Atlantic Ocean. We call that the Tethys Sea, and all that's really left of the Tethys Sea today, after India and Africa have bumped up into Eurasia, is the Mediterranean Sea, and we know that it's actually closed off there. But this is why we start to see a lot of fossil whales in India and Pakistan at this point, and also in Egypt, because those areas were shallow and warm seaways during this period of time. What do some of the other whales from India and Pakistan look like? Well, here you can see the wide range of walking forms. Some of these are known from fairly incomplete skeletons. We just have partial skeletons. But we do have some, including Pakicetus here, which is known from a virtually complete skeleton. Extremely well preserved. This is just one individual. And the amount of reconstruction that is done to get something like this is extremely minimal. Mainly just some of the tips of those processes sticking up on the vertebrae there have had to been reconstructed because they were broken. But otherwise, we know this animal in its entirety. Really, really outstanding specimen. And we think that based on the fact that this is where we see all of the most primitive looking whales, the ones that could have walked very, very easily, we think that this appears to have been where whales went back into the water. Okay? And so as they became more adapted for aquatic life, we start to actually see them spread across the globe. One of the areas where we see aquatic whales at very, very high concentrations is a place called Wadi of Autonomy, which is Arabic for Valley of Whales. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Egypt. It's about 150 kilometers southwest of Cairo in the eastern part of the Sahara Desert. And this was part of an ancient seaway about 40 million years ago that connected the modern-day Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean. And whale fossils had been first discovered here in the late 19th and early 20th century by German paleontologists, and they had been described and sort of illustrated. But not much field work had been done there since then because it was an area that wasn't really that accessible. Well, my PhD advisor, Philip Gingrich, started to explore Egypt in the mid-80s when fieldwork in Pakistan was not possible due to political situations that were there. And what he found there was just an absolutely remarkable place. The fossils there are extremely abundant and incredibly well preserved. Here you see Philip holding up some vertebrae against a fossil specimen that's eroding out of a cliff. And what you see as you sort of walk up to this area is it's at the top of a long sandy slope. And as you walk up the slope, you're just seeing bones everywhere. Like, oh, look, here's part of a rib. And you walk a few more steps, and oh, here's part of a vertebra. Walk a few more steps. Oh, here's some finger bones that we see here. And you get up to the top of this sandy hill, and eroding out of the face of the cliff is a skeleton of a whale. And the bone is so well preserved that you can just see all kinds of remarkable anatomical detail here. And this is an example of an extremely well-preserved whale. There are certainly whales that have been exposed to the elements a lot longer and aren't in nearly as nice of condition. But what's really outstanding here is in a relatively small geographic area, there have been over 1,000 individual fossil whale specimens that have been mapped here over the course of the last 20 to 30 years. So just an absolutely remarkable place. I had the chance to spend about 2 months here when I was in graduate school. And one of the whales that I worked on was an excavation of a whale called Basilosaurus, which is about a 65-foot long whale. And looking at the lower left corner here, you can see Mohammed Sami, who is one of the park rangers here at Wadi of Autonomy, and he had found this specimen. And he had climbed up sort of this rocky hillside and seen some of these teeth that were sticking out of the hillside. And that's all you could see, just some teeth that were sticking out there. So what we did over the course of about a couple of weeks is we started to sort of plow into the hillside here and move out some of this rock and try and work ourselves down to the level of where those teeth were coming out. And what we basically found was almost an entire skeleton, right? As far as we could dig. Found an entire skull, which was over 1 meter long, kind of turned upside down. With the teeth that were eroding from the cliff were part from the skull and also part from the lower jaws. We saw all kinds of vertebrae and ribs, hand bones, as well. And we know that if we could have excavated more into that hillside, we would have found probably a complete skeleton. So this is just, again, just so remarkable that we find these things in such abundance here. This is what Basilosaurus looks like when it's mounted. This is a photo from the mount at the Museum of Paleontology at the University of Michigan. And this was actually the first of the fossil whales found in about 1990, reported at least in 1990, that actually preserved a complete hind limb, where we had a pelvic bones and a femur and a kneecap and ankle bones and toes and the whole 9 yards, even though this animal is 65 feet long and only has legs that are, maybe a foot and a half long. So these were limbs that were clearly not being used for walking at all, clearly not being used for locomotion at all. Whether or not they actually still retained a function is a topic that we could debate, but it's clear that this large animal still had fully formed this very, very small hind limbs. And this is one of the most abundant whales that we see in Wadi of Autonomy in Egypt. Dorodon is the other most common whale that we see here. It's much smaller than Basilosaurus, maybe 15 to 18 feet long, clearly well adapted for life in the water, but you can see also again that it still retains these small yet fully formed hind limbs. Where things get really interesting, I think, is when we start to look at some of the fossils and we actually try and arrange them with time. And we sort of put the oldest whales first and sort of look at the anatomical characteristics of progressively younger whales. And what we see is just unmistakable trends of increasing adaptation to life in the water as we go from the oldest known fossils to the younger of the fossils here. So the oldest fossils, Pakicetus, not a lot of specialized aquatic adaptations, appears to have been very capable moving around on land. As we get to Ambulocetus, the next one, we start to see increasing aquatic adaptations, but still a lot of terrestrial capability apparent there. In fact, the name Ambulocetus natans means the walking whale that swims, because the researchers saw both of those sets of traits present in this one particular species. Looking at whales like Myocetus and Rhodocetus, we see increasing levels of aquatic adaptation until we see the most recent of the Archaeocete whales are all obligatorily aquatic because their hind limbs have been reduced so much that they actually could not have supported their weight on land anymore. We could look at virtually any system here. We could look at the skull, we could look at the vertebral column, we could look at the limbs, and we will see the same types of trends of increasing aquatic adaptation as we move forward through time. Now, I admit that this picture on this slide is a bit of an oversimplification, and this is because we have a lot of other fossils that we know about. And we have different fossils that are specialized in some really, really weird ways that are sort of offshoots from all of this as well. And so even there, when we start to put all of this together into more of a complete picture, we see this adaptive radiation that's happening, where different groups of animals are experimenting with lifestyles in different ways as they sort of explore the different niches that are open there in the water. And even when we look at the more complex picture, this general idea of increasing aquatic adaptation with time is still really prevalent, even once we take that diversity into account. So to summarize kind of what we know about whales here, we could make predictions, right? If we say that, okay, modern whales today must have evolved from something on land. If that happened, then what should we see when we go out and we look at the fossil record? Well, we should see particular anatomies, that are present in different forms. We should see those things present at different points in time. We should even find them in particular environments, right? We should find these fossils in shallow ocean sediments or maybe even in river sediments and things like that. And what is so remarkable with whales is that when we make these predictions and we go out and we look, we see animals with these intermediate anatomies. We see them when we would expect to see them in the fossil record, and we even see them in the environments where we would expect to see them, right? So all of these predictions are actually shown to be accurate once we go out there and we actually look at the fossils in the context of their ancient environments. And what makes this such a strong example of large-scale evolutionary change is that the evidence for it doesn't just come from the fossils. Right? I've talked about the fossils today because that's my area of expertise. That's where I really think you see some really cool things that illustrate this. But when we look at other areas of science, we look at development, comparative anatomy, genetics, biogeography, study the isotopes, the stable isotopes in their teeth, which indicate diet and things like that. All of these different subfields corroborate what we see in the fossil record. And they're all consistent with one another. They're all demonstrating that these animals came from a place, came from organisms that were living on land and over a period of time appear to have been adapting for new lifestyles in the water. What I illustrate here is actually different developmental stages of a dolphin. And you can see inside the red circle that even dolphins, modern dolphins today, start to develop hind limbs early in development and have that kind of sucked back up into the embryo, and it doesn't develop any further. So even looking at things like that, modern whales, we see little hints that something, there's something interesting happening there, that they have some tie back to animals that lived on land. Now again, I discussed the whale story because it's the one that I know best, but this is really just one of many different examples of large-scale evolutionary change that I could have talked about. We could talk about the evolution, the origin of the first tetrapods, the first vertebrate animals to come out on land. That is equally well studied, and again with a really excellent fossil record. We could talk about the evolution of other aquatic animals. Friends of mine studied the evolution of seals and sea lions and how they came from terrestrial carnivores. Friends of mine study manatees and dugongs, the sea cows, and understand how they actually came from terrestrial mammals as well. And we have sea cows that have 4 legs, in addition to what we see with the whale. So there are many, many different examples that illustrate this idea that life on Earth appears to have been tied together, and that we see a long period of time when life has been able to diversify and change and adapt to different environments. And that makes a lot of sense in terms of the observations that we make, things that are alive on Earth today. So my question then is, well, how do we deal with that as Christians? And this is where I'm leaving you a bit hanging, making sure you're going to watch session 2 of this series as well. Because next time, this is where we'll talk about science and faith. And we'll talk about this warfare metaphor and sort of ask, are they truly in conflict? Are they saying different things that are not able to be reconciled with one another? I'll spend some time talking about the 2 books metaphor, which I found to be extremely helpful for me, something I had never heard of until I became more knowledgeable about the Reformed tradition. So that's something that we'll spend some time talking about, and why it's actually an important thing for humans to get involved in science and study the way that the world works and has appeared to have worked over time. And then lastly, I'll spend a good deal of time talking about sort of the different ways that people think to put science and faith together. We'll talk about young Earth creationism, we'll talk about old Earth creationism, we'll talk about what we call evolutionary creationism, and we'll even talk about deism and atheistic evolutionism as well, because those all serve as different models for ways to sort of intersect science with faith. So thank you for watching, and I hope you will watch the remaining sessions of the series as well.